The Mono County Courthouse smelled of old wood and disinfectant, its fluorescent lights casting harsh shadows across worn linoleum floors. Outside, the Sierra Nevada mountains stood guard under an October sky. But inside the juvenile hearing room, the air was thick with anger and judgment. Clint Eastwood sat in the back row, his weathered hands folded quietly in his lap. At 94, he had learned to recognize injustice when he saw it, and what was unfolding before him felt fundamentally wrong. The boy couldn't have been more than 12. Miguel Santos sat perfectly still between an overwhelmed court-appointed lawyer and a Spanish interpreter who kept trying to explain proceedings that the child couldn't hear anyway. Miguel's dark eyes darted nervously around the room, taking in faces that clearly considered him guilty. District Attorney Patricia Brennan shuffled through crime scene photographs, charred remains of Pine Ridge Elementary School, twisted playground equipment, blackened foundations where children had once learned and played. "Ladies and gentlemen," Brennan began, her voice sharp with certainty. The defendant deliberately set fire to Pine Ridge Elementary School, destroying a building that served this community for 43 years. Miguel watched her lips move, understanding nothing but reading the hostility in every gesture. His small hands gripped a worn sketch pad like a lifeline, the only comfort in a room full of strangers determined to punish him. "The evidence is clear," Brennan continued, clicking through photos on her laptop. The defendant was found at the scene. He had matches in his possession. He was the only person present when the fire started. Angry murmurs rose from parents who had lost their neighborhood school, teachers who had lost decades of classroom materials, community members forced to drive 30 miles to the nearest alternative school. Furthermore, Brennan added with emphasis, the defendant has been unable or unwilling to provide any explanation for his presence. His silence speaks to consciousness of guilt. Clint's jaw tightened. The boy's silence didn't speak to guilt. It spoke to the fact that Miguel Santos was profoundly deaf and had been trying desperately to communicate through gestures and drawings in a system that demanded verbal testimony. Defense attorney David Chen rose half-heartedly. "Your Honor, my client is 12 years old, has never been in trouble and comes from a family of migrant farm workers. While Miguel was found at the scene, there's no evidence he deliberately started this fire." But Chen's words lacked conviction. Even the boy's own lawyer seemed to doubt his innocence. "Your Honor," Brennan countered, "I present Exhibit A, matches found in the defendant's pocket, bearing his fingerprints and showing evidence of recent use." The courtroom erupted. Miguel looked around in confusion, understanding that something terrible was happening but unable to grasp the specifics. That's when Clint Eastwood stood up. "The request." "Your Honor," Clint said, his distinctive voice cutting through the courtroom noise with quiet authority, "I'd like to request permission to approach the bench." Judge Margaret Rodriguez looked up in surprise. She recognized the famous actor who had made Mono County his part-time home. But his presence at a juvenile hearing was unexpected. "Mr. Eastwood, this is a closed proceeding." "Your Honor, I was in the area when the fire started. I may have information relevant to this case." Brennan objected immediately. "Mr. Eastwood isn't on the witness list." "I'm not asking to testify," Clint interrupted gently. "I'm asking for 5 minutes to try something that might help everyone understand what really happened." Judge Rodriguez studied his face, recognizing something beyond celebrity, genuine concern for justice. "Approach the bench." Clint walked forward with deliberate calm. At the bench, he spoke quietly with the judge and attorneys, his words inaudible but clearly compelling. After several minutes, Judge Rodriguez nodded. "Mr. Eastwood has made an unusual request, but given the circumstances, I'll allow it. You have 10 minutes. Clint turned to Miguel, who watched him with the intense curiosity of a child trying to understand adult behavior that made no sense. "Miguel," Clint said, approaching the boy's table. "My name is Clint. I was near your school when the fire started." The interpreter began translating, but Clint held up his hand. "He can't hear the translation anyway, but he can see." Clint sat beside Miguel, ignoring protests from both attorneys. He looked directly at the boy, made eye contact, then did something that surprised everyone. He picked up Miguel's sketchpad and turned to a clean page. Using clear gestures, Clint indicated he wanted Miguel to draw what he had seen at the school. Not what adults thought he had done, but what he had actually witnessed. Miguel looked around nervously, uncertain whether this was another trap. Clint pulled out a pencil and placed it gently in Miguel's hand. Then he drew a simple outline of the school building, showing Miguel this was about remembering. Miguel stared at the paper, then began to draw. The truth revealed. What Miguel drew in those 10 minutes changed everything. His first sketch showed the school as Clint had drawn it, but with details only someone present could know. The broken fence, the oak tree with its tire swing, the maintenance shed. Then Miguel turned the page and drew something that made Clint's eyes narrow with understanding. 2 adult figures behind the building, near the shed. One tall and thin in a maintenance uniform, one shorter in a suit jacket. They carried containers, gasoline cans, based on Miguel's careful rendering of liquid pouring from them. Miguel drew quickly, relief evident in finally having a way to tell his story. The next sketch showed the men spreading liquid around the building's base, particularly where the fire had started. The courtroom fell silent, everyone straining to see the drawings taking shape. Miguel turned to another page, drawing himself, a small figure hiding behind the oak tree, watching the men. His sketch clearly showed he was frightened, uncertain what to do. The next drawing showed the men lighting the gasoline with what appeared to be a road flare, not matches. Flames spread along the building's base as the men ran away. But the crucial drawing came next, Miguel running toward the building, not away from it. The sketch clearly showed him trying to stamp out flames, using his jacket to beat at the fire consuming the school. Clint looked up at the stunned courtroom. "Miguel," he said gently, pointing to the drawing of the boy fighting the fire. "You tried to stop it." Miguel nodded emphatically, tears forming as someone finally understood. The boy turned to his final page, the most heartbreaking image of all. Himself sitting in the ashes, crying, still holding his burned jacket. In the corner he had sketched matches scattered on the ground where the men had dropped them. District Attorney Brennan had gone pale, realizing her case was not just wrong but tragically mistaken. "Your Honor," Clint said, holding up the sketchpad for all to see, "this boy didn't start the fire. He tried to stop it, and he's been unable to tell anyone because no one bothered to find a way for him to communicate." Judge Rodriguez studied the drawings with amazement. "These drawings suggest the child witnessed the actual arsonists. This child witnessed 2 adults deliberately setting fire to the school, then tried to save the building himself. When that failed, he was found traumatized at the scene, unable to explain what he'd seen." Clint turned to the prosecutor. The matches in Miguel's pocket weren't his. They were evidence he picked up from where the real arsonists dropped them. This boy was trying to help solve the crime, not cover it up. The investigation. Within hours of Miguel's drawings being presented, the Mono County Sheriff's Department identified both men. The name patch Rodriguez belonged to Tony Rodriguez, recently terminated from school maintenance for equipment theft. The suited man was Marcus Webb, an insurance adjuster investigating district claims. The investigation revealed a conspiracy more sordid than anyone imagined. Rodriguez, bitter about termination and facing financial difficulties, had been recruited by Webb to stage the fire. Webb's motivation was covering years of embezzlement from insurance settlements. The school district had begun investigating discrepancies in his claim handling. By destroying the school and records, Webb hoped to eliminate evidence while collecting a substantial payout he could manipulate. Rodriguez agreed for a share of the insurance money. Neither anticipated being witnessed by a 12-year-old boy exploring the grounds during his family's brief area stop. Even more importantly, they never expected Miguel Santos would risk his safety trying to stop the fire they'd set. Rodriguez and Webb's arrests made regional news, but the story capturing broader attention was Miguel's heroism and the justice system's near-catastrophic failure to protect a vulnerable child. Clint Eastwood, who rarely spoke to media about local matters, made an exception. "Miguel Santos is a hero," Clint told the local reporter. "He saw adults committing a crime, tried to stop them, then was punished because no one took time to understand what he was trying to tell them." What does this case say about treating children with disabilities? "We have a long way to go," Clint replied. "This boy was failed by every system meant to protect him. Law enforcement, courts, even legal representation. He was saved only because someone finally thought to let him tell his story in a way he could communicate." "What made you ask Miguel to draw?" Clint was quiet, looking toward the mountains surrounding the courthouse where Miguel's life had nearly been destroyed. "Years ago, I worked with a deaf actress. She taught me communication isn't just words, it's finding ways to connect on people's terms, not forcing them to conform to ours." Miguel had a story to tell. He'd been trying from the moment of arrest. The problem wasn't that he couldn't communicate. It was that no one was listening in a language he could use. The community response. As Miguel's story became public, it highlighted broader challenges faced by deaf children in rural communities, particularly immigrant families with limited resources. The Santos family were migrant workers following seasonal agricultural work throughout California and Nevada. Miguel had been born deaf, and his parents, despite limited resources and education, had worked tirelessly to help him develop communication skills. Miguel's sketchpad, seeming like a simple drawing book, was actually a sophisticated communication tool his mother had developed through years of trial and error. Unable to afford formal sign language training or special education, Maria Santos had taught her son to use drawing as his primary complex communication method. The detailed accuracy of Miguel's drawings, his ability to capture faces, objects, and event sequences, resulted from years practicing visual communication as his lifeline to the world. Dr. Sarah Chen, a deaf education specialist brought in to evaluate Miguel's case, observed, "This family created their own support system without formal resources. Miguel's visual communication skills are quite advanced for his age, particularly without traditional educational services." Local advocacy groups began reaching out, offering resources never before available. The California School for the Deaf offered Miguel a scholarship, organizations volunteered transportation and housing assistance for better educational opportunities. But the most meaningful support came from an unexpected source, the community that had initially blamed Miguel. The apology and recognition. 2 weeks after exoneration, Pine Ridge organized a gathering. Part apology, part celebration, part commitment to improvement. The community center event honored Miguel and his family as guests. Clint attended not as a celebrity, but as the man who helped reveal truth when the system failed. Mayor Patricia Williams addressed the crowd, many who had demanded Miguel's punishment days earlier. "We're here to do something overdue," she began. Apologized to Miguel Santos and his family for a justice failure reflecting poorly on all of us. Speaking through an interpreter while Miguel watched her expressions. "Miguel, we're sorry we blamed you for something you didn't do. Sorry we didn't listen when you tried telling the truth. Sorry it took a stranger to remind us of our obligation to protect children, not prosecute them." Fire Chief Robert Martinez stepped forward with the most powerful moment. "Miguel Santos, I've fought fires for 23 years and seen brave people do dangerous things protecting others. But I've never seen anyone braver than a 12-year-old trying to fight a deliberately set fire with nothing but his jacket and determination to save his school." Chief Martinez presented Miguel with the Pine Ridge Volunteer Fire Department Civilian Heroism Award for risking his safety to protect community property. As Miguel accepted the award, his parents wept with pride and relief. But Miguel seemed more interested in showing community members drawings he'd brought, pictures of the fire, the school before destruction, and his vision of what it could become when rebuilt. One drawing captured everyone's attention. Miguel's vision of the new school featuring traditional classrooms and spaces for children with different needs, including a room for visual and tactile learning. The transformation. Miguel's drawing sparked something unexpected, realization that rebuilding could create something better than what was lost. Dr. Chen was invited to consult on rebuilding. After meeting Miguel and studying his drawings, she proposed something revolutionary for a small rural community. What if we rebuilt Pine Ridge Elementary as a model for inclusive education? A school serving both hearing and deaf children, using visual and tactile learning methods Miguel has mastered. Initial skepticism met the idea. Pine Ridge was a small farming community with limited resources and no special education experience. But Miguel's story had touched the community's conscience. People who initially demanded prosecution now felt responsibility ensuring no child would again be failed by protective systems. Clint made a surprising announcement at a school board meeting. "I'd like to donate to the rebuilding project. Not just construction, but specialized equipment and training for this inclusive education model." When asked about the amount, "Whatever it takes." Miguel Santos risked his life trying to save this school. "The least we can do is rebuild honoring what he tried to protect." Community response was overwhelming. Local businesses offered materials and labor. Parents volunteered time. Agricultural companies employing migrant workers contributed funding. But the most important contribution came from Miguel himself. The new vision. As plans developed, Miguel's visual communication skills and intuitive understanding of inclusive design made him an invaluable project consultant. Working with Dr. Chen and architects, Miguel created detailed drawings showing spaces designed for children with different communication needs. His sketches included visual alert systems, flexible learning spaces accommodating hearing and deaf students, and common areas encouraging interaction between children communicating differently. Miguel's parents, initially overwhelmed by attention, gradually understood their child's unique perspective was valuable in ways they'd never imagined. For 12 years, Maria Santos told Dr. Chen through an interpreter, "I thought Miguel's deafness was something to overcome or work around. I never thought it could help other children." Juan Santos had been particularly concerned about the family's sudden prominence. "We are workers. We move place to place, follow crops, stay out of trouble. This attention isn't what we're used to." But CLINT helped them understand broader implications of Miguel's story. 1. Your son didn't just help solve a crime. He showed an entire community they were wrong about what children with disabilities can contribute. That's not something to hide from. It's something to be proud of. Miguel became a regular presence at the construction site, not as curiosity but as genuine design contributor. His visual acuity spotted potential problems others missed, and his spatial understanding informed classroom layout and common area decisions. Local contractor Bill Stevens, initially skeptical about taking design advice from a 12-year-old, became one of Miguel's strongest advocates. "This kid sees things we miss. He notices how spaces will actually be used by children, not just how they look on paper. We're building a better school because of his input." The success 1 year after the fire nearly destroyed Miguel Santos's life, New Pine Ridge Elementary opened as California's first fully inclusive deaf hearing education facility in a rural setting. Opening ceremony drew statewide visitors, educators, advocates, and families interested in how a small farming community transformed tragedy into innovation. Miguel, now 13 and confident in his advocacy role, cut the ribbon alongside Mayor Williams and CLINT Eastwood. Real success came in following weeks as students experienced education Miguel's vision made possible. Hearing children learned basic sign language alongside traditional curriculum. Deaf children like Miguel accessed visual learning tools and communication methods never available in rural settings. Most importantly, both groups learned to see different communication styles as interesting variations rather than barriers. Miguel's teacher, Mrs. Rodriguez, no relation to the arsonist, had specialized training in inclusive education. She worked with Miguel developing presentations about his experience and school vision. Miguel doesn't just attend this school, he helped design it. He continues contributing ideas for improving our teaching methods. He's not just a student, he's a collaborator creating something new. School success attracted State Department of Education attention, designating Pine Ridge Elementary as a pilot program for rural inclusive education. Dr. Chen, now Special Education Coordinator, often used Miguel's story exemplifying how children with disabilities could be resources rather than challenges. Miguel Santos saved this school twice. First, he literally tried saving it from fire. Then, he saved it from traditional thinking traps about what schools should be and who they should serve. The recognition. 2 years after the fire, Miguel received surprising honor. The California State Assembly passed a resolution recognizing his heroism and inclusive education contribution, officially designating him Young Hero of California. The state capitol ceremony honored Miguel and family as guests. CLINT accompanied them, not as celebrity attendee but as family friend who watched Miguel grow from traumatized child into confident young advocate. Miguel presented his drawings to assembled legislators using an interpreter and large display screen, showing progression from desperate courtroom sketches that saved him to architectural drawings helping design his school. The most powerful moment came when Miguel presented a new drawing created for the occasion. Children who looked different, communicated differently, and learned differently, all playing together on a playground accommodating everyone. At the bottom, Miguel had written in careful English, "Different is not wrong, different is just different." The standing ovation lasted several minutes, but Miguel seemed more interested in legislators' and visitors' faces seeing his work than in applause. Assembly Speaker Maria Gonzalez spoke with Miguel through an interpreter afterward. "Miguel, your story has inspired changes in how our state thinks about inclusive education and treating children with disabilities in the justice system. Do you understand how important your contribution has been?" Miguel nodded and drew quickly. A small stone creating pond ripples, spreading wider until reaching page edges. Speaker Gonzalez studied the drawing and smiled. "You understand your actions had consequences far beyond imagination." Miguel nodded and wrote a single word. "See." The legacy 5 years post-fire, Miguel Santos had become something unimaginable, a nationally recognized advocate for inclusive education and deaf rights. Now 17 and Pine Ridge High Senior, which had also implemented inclusive policies, Miguel traveled regularly speaking at conferences and schools about his experience and education vision. His presentations were unique, combining drawings, sign language, and written communication instead of traditional speeches. His visual storytelling was so compelling that hearing audiences often understood his message more clearly than conventional spoken presentations. The Pine Ridge model had been replicated in 12 other rural communities across California and Nevada. The state established grants specifically helping small districts implement inclusive education based on Miguel's original vision. Dr. Chen, now close family friend and Miguel's unofficial mentor, often marveled at the transformation. 5 years ago, Miguel was a traumatized child failed by every protective system. Today, he's a young man actively changing those systems for the better. Perhaps most significant was Miguel's own change. The frightened courthouse boy clutching his sketchpad had grown into a confident young man, understanding his unique perspective was valuable. Not just personally and familially, but community-wide. Miguel's parents had also transformed. They learned English, became involved in migrant worker family advocacy, and established a small nonprofit connecting rural families with educational resources for children with disabilities. Miguel taught us, Maria Santos said through an interpreter, that being different isn't something to hide or apologize for. It's something to celebrate and share. The full circle. On the 5th anniversary, Clint returned to Pine Ridge Elementary for a ceremony commemorating not just averted tragedy, but subsequent transformation. The school was now an inclusive education showcase, with students communicating in multiple languages and methods, learning from each other as much as from teachers. Miguel, now tall but still carrying his life-saving sketchpad, approached Clint with a special anniversary drawing. The drawing showed the courthouse where they first met. But instead of accusation and fear, Miguel had drawn it as a place where understanding triumphed over prejudice, where communication overcame confusion. At the center was the moment Clint handed Miguel a pencil and asked him to show what he'd seen, the turning point changing everything. "Miguel," Clint said, "asking you to draw that day was one of the most important things I've ever done. Not because it made me look good, but because it reminded me everyone has a story worth hearing, if we take time to listen in the right language." Miguel wrote, "You didn't just listen to my story. You helped me understand my story mattered." Clint studied the anniversary drawing, noting incredible detail and emotional depth Miguel's artistic skills had developed. "You've become one hell of an artist. But more than that, you've become someone helping other people see the world differently." Miguel smiled and opened his sketchpad to a page he'd been saving. 5 years ago, I thought being deaf meant I couldn't tell people what I saw. Now I know being deaf means I see things other people miss. Thank you for helping me understand the difference." As ceremony concluded, Clint watched Miguel interact with younger students, deaf and hearing children who'd learned to communicate across different methods, who saw diversity as normal rather than unusual. "What you started here will outlast both of us. These kids are growing up in a world where being different is just another way of being human." Miguel nodded and drew one final sketch. Children of all different abilities playing together, with sun shining equally on all. Under the drawing, "This is what I saw in my dreams. Now it's real." The continuing impact. 10 years after a deaf boy nearly lost his freedom for a crime he tried to prevent, Miguel Santos graduated UC with a degree in educational design and deaf studies. His thesis, Visual Communication in Inclusive Learning Environments, became required reading in statewide teacher training programs. Miguel's educational policy influence extended far beyond Pine Ridge. The Santos model had been implemented in over 100 schools, serving thousands of children who might otherwise have been marginalized. More importantly, Miguel's story changed justice system approaches to cases involving children with disabilities. New protocols required alternative communication support for any child unable to communicate through traditional verbal methods before legal proceedings could begin. Clint Eastwood, now in his late 90s but still sharp, continued following Miguel's career with mentor's pride, watching a protege exceed all expectations. "People ask about my legacy," Clint said during a rare interview about the Miguel Santos case. "They want to know about movies or awards, but honestly the thing I'm most proud of is the day I asked a scared kid to draw me a picture. Miguel Santos taught me something applying to every life part. Everyone has something valuable to contribute if you give them the right communication way. The tragedy isn't that some people can't speak your language. The tragedy is when you don't bother learning theirs." Miguel, now working as Department of Education consultant and preparing to open his own inclusive arts education school, kept the original courthouse sketches that saved his life framed in his office. Visitors often asked about the drawings, and Miguel would tell the story, not as a victim who was saved, but as someone who learned his differences were actually strengths. When I was 12, Miguel would write for visitors who couldn't sign. I thought the world was divided into people who could hear and people who couldn't. Now I know the world is divided into people who listen and people who don't. The hearing had nothing to do with your ears. It had everything to do with your heart. At his office wall's bottom, Miguel hung one final drawing, the simple sketch of Clint Eastwood sitting beside him in the courthouse, offering him a pencil and the chance to tell his truth. Under that drawing, Miguel had written his personal motto: "Sometimes the most important conversations happen in silence." Years later, when young advocates would visit seeking advice about fighting for inclusive education or defending children with disabilities rights, he would always show them that courthouse drawing. This, Miguel would explain through interpreter or careful written English, is the moment someone chose to listen with their eyes instead of their ears. That choice changed my life. But more importantly, it taught me everyone deserves to have their story heard, no matter what language they use to tell it. The visitors would study the simple drawing of an elderly man and young boy, connected by nothing more than pencil and paper, and understand that the most profound acts of justice often begin with the simplest acts of human recognition. Miguel Santos had learned that truth at age 12, when he was nearly destroyed by a system that couldn't hear his voice. But Clint Eastwood had taught him something even more important. Everyone has a story worth telling, if someone is willing to listen in the right language. And in a courthouse in Mono County, where accusations had once threatened to destroy a child's life, that lesson had transformed not just one boy's future, but an entire community's understanding of what it means to truly listen.